Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to lead off with Lawrence Walsh, who died recently at the age of 102. Lawrence Walsh was the special prosecutor in the Iran-Contra scandal, which was the biggest scandal of the Ronald Reagan administration. In the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, the Contras were a right-wing paramilitary group in Nicaragua who were fighting the Sandinistas, the left-wing government, so it was sort of a Cold War struggle in Central America. The United States at the time was supporting the Contras during the Reagan administration, but they were prohibited from giving direct aid by the Boland Amendment. Some of Reagan's operatives, including Colonel Oliver North from the Marines, and it may have extended as high as Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, found a way around the Boland Amendment by selling arms to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War and using the proceeds to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. When that came out late 1986, it was a huge scandal. There was a separation of powers issue because it was executive branch people against the Congress, and there were calls for special prosecutor. Lawrence Walsh became the special prosecutor. That was at age 75, by the way. His history extended back to the Tom Dewey crime busters. He was one of Tom Dewey's crime busters in the 1940s. In the 1950s, he investigated longshore corruption on the docks of New York City, the stuff that On the Waterfront was based on. And 30 years later, he became the special prosecutor for Iran-Contra, which was a little surprising because he was a Republican. Here's a report from NPR with Nina Totenberg discussing Lawrence Walsh.
Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor who investigated charges of wrongdoing and criminality by top Reagan administration officials in the Iran-Contra scandal, has died. And joining us in the studio is NPR legal affairs correspondent Nina Totenberg, who covered Walsh before and during the Iran-Contra scandal. Nina, first let's remind folks what the Iran-Contra affair is all about.
The scandal merged two secret operations. On President Reagan's orders, his administration provided weapons to rebels opposed to the leftist government in Nicaragua. And at the time, Congress had barred the Pentagon and the CIA from giving aid to the so-called Contras. The funding for the operation came instead from the secret sale of arms to Iran, at a time when President Reagan hoped that Iran might help free 4 American hostages being held in Lebanon. It was called the Arms for Hostages deal. Neither the public nor Congress knew about either of these operations, and when they were exposed, President Reagan had little choice but to ask for the appointment of an independent counsel.
Two remarkable things about him at that time. Walsh was almost 75 years old when he was appointed, and he was a very well-known Republican commodity.
His career had already included a huge number of public service positions, from a racket-busting young prosecutor in New York to general counsel of a commission to clean up the New York and New Jersey docks, from federal judge to deputy attorney general at the time of the Little Rock school desegregation, from deputy U.S. negotiator at the Paris peace talks with North Vietnam to Wall Street litigator and president of the American Bar Association. His age and establishment credentials might have led some to believe his investigation would be relatively pro forma. It was anything but, taking 6 years and costing $47 million. Walsh said it was because the very agencies he was investigating, the White House, CIA, State Department, and Defense Department, were thwarting him at every turn in a further attempt to cover up misconduct. Walsh's critics said he was a zealot, guilty of prosecutorial abuse.
And the results of his investigation?
11 people pleaded guilty or were convicted by juries, but because Congress had granted limited immunity to the president's national security advisor, John Poindexter, and his aide, Oliver North, in exchange for their testimony, the convictions were reversed on appeal. The biggest prosecution of all, against Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, never came to fruition. On Christmas Eve, 2 weeks before jury selection was to begin in 1992, and shortly before President George H.W. Bush was to leave office, Bush pardoned Weinberger and 5 other Iran-Contra figures. An infuriated Walsh reacted this way.
President Bush's pardon of Caspar Weinberger and other Iran-Contra defendants undermines the principle that no man is above the law. It demonstrates that powerful people with powerful allies can commit serious crimes in high office, deliberately abusing the public trust without consequences.
Here is Lawrence Walsh announcing the final product of the nearly 7-year investigation of the Iran-Contra scandal. Started in the Reagan administration. The report didn't come out until the Clinton administration.
Today, the panel of senior judges who appoint independent counsel made public the final report on the Iran-Contra criminal investigations and prosecutions. This report is likely to be the last official word on Iran-Contra. It was publicly exposed 7 years ago. The activities prompted my appointment in December of 1986. At that time, the public trust in government had been badly shaken as a result of the revelations that the Reagan administration had been secretly selling arms to Iran, that it had been secretly supporting the Contra military effort in Nicaragua, and that there had been an intermingling of those two operations in the diversion of Iran arms sales proceeds to the Contras. Much is now known about these matters and how they evolved and who was responsible. This final report fully describes our findings and prosecutorial decisions. Unlike earlier reports by the Tower Commission and the Congressional Iran-Contra committees, our report focuses on the criminal dimension of the affair. Those earlier investigations were obstructed by lies and other means. Our report therefore adds some new facts to the historic record.
A year later, Walsh discussed the outcome of the prosecutions, and he was a little disappointed by it. He's referring here, by the way, to George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, not Bush 43.
Do you think that a number of those involved got off easy?
I think in terms of sentences imposed on other people, it may seem that way. But I think it's also important to realize that the courts, in imposing sentence, were dealing with persons who had invested in enormous amounts in public service and in service to the country. They were giving up the full value of that investment when they were convicted or pleaded guilty. And I think the courts took that into account. I think also the sentencing courts may have been inhibited by immunity granted in some of the cases. They were not anxious to challenge the appellate court any more than they had to. But those were two factors, I think. I think President Bush will always have to answer for his pardon. I think that was the most unjustifiable act. There was no public purpose served by that. The others who tried to serve President Reagan's policy thought they were serving the public. But President Bush can never justify the pardons as an act of public service. President Reagan, on the other hand, was carrying out policies that he strongly believed. He may have been willful. He thought he was serving the country in what he did. And the fact that he disregarded certain laws and statutes in the course of it was not because of any possibly self-centered purpose.
We're going to move on now to Jack Fleck, who died recently at the age of 92. He pulled off one of the great upsets in golf. In 1955, he upset Ben Hogan in the U.S. Open. Hogan was the Tiger Woods of his day, a sentimental favorite. Fleck was little more than the club pro from Iowa. Fleck caught him on the last hole of the Open and beat him in an 18-round playoff the next day. Here's a USGA clip on one of the great upsets in golf history.
The Olympic Country Club at San Francisco with more than 15,000 jamming around for the last act of the U.S. Open. Mancha Ben Hogan hits his approach to the final green, and it looks as if he's about to become the first man ever to win the big crown a fifth time. He strokes it, and the ball slides just below the hole. It leaves him a simple little tap for a 4 that finishes a strong last round of par 7. That gives Hogan a score of 287, and it appears that he has clinched the Open Championship for the fifth time in a glorious career. Jack Fleck, an obscure municipal course pro from Davenport, Iowa. That chance is still slim. He needs a birdie to tie, but he hits a beautiful shot from the rough, hole high and only 8 feet away. He strokes it perfectly, and it's in to tie the great Hogan for the title. And you can see now the strain Fleck has been feeling. From out of nowhere, the Cinderella man has bobbed up to challenge mighty Hogan as the top man in American golf. Next day, the climax, an 18-hole playoff for the crown. And here's Hogan, considered a sure winner in any man-to-man duel. Now for the man few sports fans knew a week ago, Jack Fleck. Now, after 9 holes, Hogan is 2 strokes down to Fleck as he holes out on the 10th. And here's Fleck. He has a long one of about 20 feet. He rolls it in as if it had eyes, and now he leads by 3 shots. Now at the 18th, Hogan has made up 2 of those shots and trails by only 1, but he is hooked into the rough, and twice he fails to smash it out. Hogan is really beaten now, but with that bulldog spirit for which he is famous, he eases his 30-foot putt right into the cup. Fleck has the title in his pocket. He sends a nice putt up next to the cup, and then without hurrying or wasting time, he taps it in. He beats Hogan 69-72, and from obscurity he springs into fame as the open golf king of the United States.
12 years later, the great sports writer Jim Murray wrote a great column about Jack Fleck in the LA Times. America is very hard on its myth destroyers. You're better off robbing a bank than being Jack Dempsey. You can poison Santa Claus, but don't strike out Babe Ruth. Even the fellow who shot Jesse James got celebrated in song and story as the dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard. John Wilkes Booth is a national idol compared to a guy who knocks out Joe Louis. Out on the greens and fairways at the LA Open this week was another tragic figure of history, the man who beat Ben Hogan. What Roger Maris is to baseball, Gene Tunney to boxing, what Wellington was to warfare, and Brutus was to Caesar, Jack Donald Fleck is to golf. He is anti-history, a roadblock on the royal road to romance, an inkblot on the pages of legend. To understand what happened to Jack Fleck, you have to understand what happened to Ben Hogan. He was more than a golfing master that year of 1955. He was a golfing messiah. Arnie may have his army, but Hogan had a whole religion. Worshippers from Carnoustie to Chicago, Tasmania to Texas. He was the Pope of golf. You didn't admire Ben Hogan, you believed in him. He was the Hawk, the Iceman, the living legend. The serpent in his Garden of Eden was Jack Fleck. He had never won a tournament at the time he beat Hogan. He was only to win one thereafter. It has been titled by one sports writer as, along with Roger Maris' toppling of Ruth, as the year of the great mistake. But Fleck had all the shots that year when he arrived at Olympic Country Club. He was an outstanding driver. His nerves were as steady as an aerialist's. His putting stroke miraculously appeared on the 15th hole. Even so, Fleck was a bigger victim of that Open than Ben Hogan. It altered his life. He became the man who beat Ben Hogan, not just promising young Jack Fleck. Golf-wise, he had gone right from baby formula champagne. He was dined, signed. I wasn't cut out for speeches and staying up nights, even at banquets, he recalls ruefully. I was a country boy. It affected his game. He couldn't tee it up as Jack Fleck anymore. He became the you-know-who did you-know-what. Golf crowds are too polite to hiss, but you can feel hostility on a golf course. The unsaid miss it would be easier to take if shouted. No one knew it, but Jack Fleck had stood on the pitching deck of a rocket-launching ship less than 1,000 yards off Normandy Beach on D-Day, flinging shells into German forts as the landing troops debarked. He was steaming toward Tokyo on the same ship when the Japanese picked up in that tournament. Jack Fleck won only 2 more tournaments, only 3 in his life. Nightmarishly, he missed the cut the very next Open. Like the man who shot Liberty Valance, he enjoyed reverse popularity. The man who shot Germans became a myth killer, an anti-hero, a guy who put crayon on the Mona Lisa, hung his hat on a Michelangelo statue. He had aborted more than Hogan's record. He had aborted his own fine career. Did he feel on reflection it was worth it? Question came as Jack Fleck sat in the gathering gloom of a locker room and listened to the sounds of another tournament in which his fading talents had once more failed to make the cut. Yes, he said slowly, all in all, I think so. It's better to be somebody, even if it's only once in your life. We're going to close tonight with Mitch Leigh, who died at the age of 86, nice Jewish boy from Brownsville, my dad's neighborhood, who was an advertising jingle writer and wrote one of the most famous jingles of all time.
Everybody doesn't like something, but nobody doesn't like Sara Lee. Everybody doesn't like something, but nobody doesn't like Sara Lee. Everybody doesn't like something,
But nobody doesn't like Sara Lee.
but nobody doesn't like Sara Lee.
Little throw Ravenscroft at the end there. But Mitch Leigh also did one other thing. He wrote one Broadway musical, and it was a great one, Man of La Mancha. And that featured one of the great songs, one of the great performances in Broadway history, Richard Kiley singing The Impossible Dream.
Dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe. And I only be true to this glorious quest, that my heart will lie peaceful and calm when I'm laid to my rest.
I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. Normally I would have closed with that, but I'm going to play another song from Man of La Mancha that Mitch Leigh wrote. I didn't think anybody could do it as well as Richard Kiley, but I went and saw the great Linda Eder perform recently, and she did Don Quixote's theme, and I have to tell you, it's in the running.
Surrender.